Tonight, we begin on a cliff above the Atlantic where Dunluce Castle clings to black basalt rock like a thought that refuses to let go. Here, the sea never rests, the wind never asks permission, and the waves below have been shaping the story longer than any family ever ruled the walls above them. This is a place built for ambition and survival, where bridges can be cut, kitchens can fall into the ocean, and every window faces the horizon as if waiting for something to arrive by ship. From there, we travel inland along the slow curve of the River Boyne to Trim Castle, where a great limestone keep rises from the valley like a stone compass planted in the earth. Here, roads converge, bridges decide who may pass, and the river carries 8 centuries of reflection past walls that once ruled a private kingdom. These are castles shaped by different kinds of power. One faces the open sea, the other commands a river crossing. One listens to the wind, the other watches the roads. The fire is warm, the stone is ancient. There is nothing left for you to do now but listen, settle into the quiet, let the day loosen its grip, and follow the slow pull of history, as steady as the tide beneath the cliffs and as patient as the river beneath the bridge. Most castles are built. Dunluce was erupted. The story begins not with an architect's blueprint, but with a geological grudge. 60 million years ago, the earth here didn't just shift, it tore itself open. Molten basalt poured out of the crust, cooling into hard black hexagonal columns. And then, slowly, the Atlantic Ocean spent the next few eons chewing away the soft parts. What remained was a mistake in the coastline. A massive basalt stack detached from the mainland, rising 100 feet straight up out of the churning white foam. It is a geological island, separated from the rest of Ireland by a chasm that drops into a dark, jagged cave system below. On 3 sides there are sheer vertical cliffs that offer no handholds, only a slick, wet drop into freezing water. The only connection to the rest of the world is a razor-thin neck of rock, a natural bridge that looks less like a path and more like a trap. Nature had created the perfect fortress long before a human being ever set foot in County Antrim. The geography did the heavy lifting. If you stood on that rock, you didn't need a high wall, you just needed to not fall off. It was a piece of real estate that came with a built-in moat, a 360-degree view, and a fatality rate for anyone trying to visit without an invitation. But humans are a stubborn species, and isolation is a commodity. Around 800 AD the first residents arrived. They weren't building towers yet, they were digging holes. The earliest surviving structure on Dunluce isn't a soaring keep, it is a souterrain. To the untrained eye, a souterrain looks like a drain. To an early Irish chieftain, it was the difference between life and death. It is a dry stone tunnel, dug into the earth and lined with flat slabs. It required no mortar, just gravity and friction. Its purpose was dual and grimly practical. In peace, it was a refrigerator. The temperature underground remains a constant cool 50 degrees, perfect for storing butter, cheese and salted meats, away from the flies and the summer heat. In war it was a panic room. When the sails appeared on the horizon, and they always appeared, the women, the children, and the valuables were shoved into the darkness. The entrance would be covered with turf, disappearing into the grass. Inside it was cramped, pitch black, and smelled of earth and fear. You sat in the silence, listening to the muffled sounds of violence above, waiting for the raiders to leave or for the air to run out. It was architecture born of anxiety. Above the souterrain the rock was crowned by a cashel, or ring fort. There was no stone castle yet. Instead there was an earthen bank topped with a timber palisade. It was a rough wooden crown on a basalt king. Living here required a specific kind of nerve. The wind on the North Antrim coast is not a breeze, it is a physical assault. It strips the warmth from your bones and the thatch from your roof. The timber walls would have groaned constantly, a wooden chorus accompanying the crashing of the waves below. There were no guardrails. If you stumbled in the dark, you didn't hit a fence, you hit the Atlantic. But the view was worth the risk. From the edge of the palisade, you looked out over the sea road. Today, we think of the ocean as a barrier, a blue emptiness that separates nations. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, the North Channel was the motorway of the Viking world. This was the maritime highway of the Sudrea, the kingdom of the Isles. Norse Gaels, those hybrid warriors with Viking axes and Irish tempers, sailed these waters constantly. They moved between Dublin, the Hebrides and Scotland with the ease of commuters. To them, Dunluce wasn't a remote outpost at the edge of the world. It was a service station on the main drag. The rock served as a watchtower. A fire lit on Dunluce could be seen for miles out at sea, a navigation beacon for friendly ships, or a warning flare for the locals to get into the souterrain. While no Viking king likely ruled it directly in these early years, the rock belonged to the sphere of the Sea Kings. It was part of a liquid empire, held together by oak hulls and square sails. For 500 years the rock sat there, a timber fort rotting in the salt spray, a dark tunnel hiding beneath the grass, a black basalt stack waiting for someone with enough ambition and enough stone to turn it into a legend. The wood would eventually rot away, the earth banks would erode. But the souterrain remained, a dry stone memory of the days when the only defence against the world was to hide beneath the surface. But now the Normans were coming, and they didn't plan on hiding. By 1300 the era of dirt banks and wooden fences was over. The Normans had arrived in Ireland, and they brought with them two things: bureaucracy and masonry. Richard de Burgh, the Red Earl of Ulster, looked at the basalt stack and saw something the Vikings hadn't. The Vikings saw a lookout post. De Burgh saw an asset class. He recognised that this wasn't just a place to survive a raid. It was a place to administer a territory. The first written records of a castle appear now, but this wasn't yet the brooding fortress of legend. It was a manor, a profitable administrative hub where rents were collected, disputes were settled, and the Normans attempted to impose a grid of feudal order on the chaotic, boggy reality of North Antrim. But the Normans overextended, and in the vacuum of their waning power, a new force arrived from across the water, the Macquillans. They were Galloglass, a corruption of Gaul or Gley, meaning foreign young warriors. In practice, they were Scottish mercenaries, heavy infantry who fought with 6-foot axes and bad attitudes. They were hired muscle who decided they liked the neighbourhood enough to evict the landlords and move in. The Macquillans seized the rock and declared themselves lords of the root. And they didn't want a manor house. They wanted a weapon. Under the Macquillans, the rock began its true transformation into a stone giant. They looked at the geology, the black hexagonal columns of basalt, and decided to match it. They built the gatehouse. This wasn't a welcoming entrance. It was a statement of intent. They constructed 2 massive circular drum towers flanking the entrance. This was a Scottish style of defence, imported directly across the North Channel. The genius was in the material. They used the local stone, dark, jagged basalt. Most castles of this era were whitewashed with lime to shine like beacons, shouting their presence to the countryside. Dunluce did the opposite. It was built to disappear. During the day, the towers looked like a natural extension of the cliff, a vertical continuation of the volcanic rock. At night, the castle vanished entirely. Against the black sky and the dark sea, the black walls became invisible. Raiders approaching from the mainland wouldn't see a fortress until they were already on the bridge, staring down the arrow slits. It was stealth technology, rendered in stone. It was a fortress that didn't just defend the cliff, it became the cliff. But the Macquillans knew that a castle with one entrance is a trap. If the bridge is blockaded, you starve. So they engineered a back door. Beneath the castle, the sea had carved a massive cathedral-like cavern through the basalt. We call it the Mermaid's Cave, a name that implies romance and fantasy. The reality was far more utilitarian. The builders cut a steep, terrifying staircase through the solid rock, descending from the courtyard straight down into the darkness of the cave. This wasn't for beach access. It was a logistical lifeline. The cave opens directly to the ocean. Small boats could navigate the swells and glide into the shelter of the cavern, hidden from view from the mainland. While an enemy army sat at the front door, starving and waiting for the surrender, the garrison was hauling fresh supplies, salted fish, and kegs of ale up the stairs from the cave. The Mermaid's Cave turned the ocean from a prison wall into a supply highway. It meant that to take Dunluce, you didn't just have to block the bridge, you had to blockade the North Atlantic. The Macquillans had built a masterpiece of integration. The towers merged with the sky. The basement merged with the sea. The castle was no longer a structure sitting on the rock, it was the rock. But stone and geography can't protect you from politics. The Macquillans were tough, but they were about to meet a clan that was tougher, more ambitious, and significantly better at marriage alliances. The MacDonalds were looking across the channel, and they liked the look of the black towers. By the mid-16th century, the Macquillans were sitting comfortably in their invisible black fortress. They were the lords of the root, masters of the cliff. But they had made a classic real estate error. They forgot to check who was moving in next door. The MacDonalds were not just a clan, they were a multinational corporation of violence. Based in the Western Isles of Scotland, the MacDonalds viewed the North Channel not as a border, but as a driveway. To them, the Glens of Antrim were just the southern suburbs of their island kingdom. They were the lords of the Isles, and they were looking to expand their portfolio. The takeover didn't begin with a siege, it began with a wedding. In the brutal politics of the 1500s, marriage wasn't about romance. It was a merger and acquisition strategy, with a high probability of stabbing. Colin MacDonald, a man with a sharp mind and a sharper axe, married into the Macquillan family. On paper, this was an alliance. The Macquillans got the support of the MacDonalds' heavy infantry, the Gallowglass. The MacDonalds got a foothold in Antrim. It was the Trojan horse tactic, but instead of a wooden horse, it was a very large, very hungry Scottish army that came for dinner and refused to leave. The arrangement worked for a while. The MacDonalds fought the Macquillans' enemies. They earned their keep. But in the Highlands and Islands, there is a concept called coin and livery, the right of a lord and his troops to be housed and fed by their subjects during the winter. The MacDonalds began to stretch this hospitality until it snapped. They ate the Macquillans' beef, they drank the Macquillans' ale, and when the Macquillans politely suggested that perhaps it was time for their guests to go home to Scotland, the MacDonalds pointed out that they were quite comfortable where they were. The guests had decided they were the new management. The tension simmered, boiled, and finally exploded on the slopes of Slieve and Orra. The Battle of Orra was the decisive moment. The Macquillans, realising they were being evicted from their own lordship, gathered their forces for one final push to drive the Scots back into the sea. But the MacDonalds didn't just have muscle, they had cunning. The lore of the battle tells of a grim, Looney Tunes-style trap. The MacDonalds arrived at the battlefield early. They looked at the boggy, treacherous ground and saw an opportunity. They cut rushes and grass, laying them carefully over the deep, sucking mud of the bog to make it look like solid ground. Then they waited. When the Macquillan heavy cavalry charged, expecting the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel, they got the wet, squelching sound of disaster. The horses hit the fake ground and sank to their bellies. The charge stalled. The momentum died in the mud. The MacDonalds, standing on the solid ground they had scouted earlier, simply stepped forward and finished the job. It wasn't a battle, it was a liquidation. The Macquillan power was broken in an afternoon. The Lords of the Root were history. The survivors fled south, leaving the black basalt towers of Dunluce to the victors. The castle had a new master now, enter Sawley Boy MacDonell. Sawley Boy, from Gaelic meaning yellow-haired summerled, was the younger brother of Collar, but he was the one who would stamp his name onto the rock forever. He didn't just want a fortress, he wanted a capital. Under the MacDonalds, Dunluce ceased to be a local Irish stronghold and became the headquarters of a cross-channel empire. Sawley Boy sat in the great hall looking out the window. To the south, he saw the green fields of Ireland which he intended to rule. To the north, across the grey water, he saw the peaks of Islay and Jura, where his ships were docked. He was afoot in both worlds, and Dunluce was the bridge. The Maquillan ghosts were likely still haunting the mermaid's cave, but upstairs the bagpipes were playing. The MacDonalds had arrived, and as the English crown was about to discover, evicting a MacDonald is significantly harder than inviting one in. If the Maquillans were the warm-up act, Sawley Boy MacDonell was the headliner. His name means yellow-haired summerled, but to the English crown he was simply the problem. Sawley Boy wasn't just a chieftain, he was a geopolitical migraine for Queen Elizabeth I. He was a man who viewed the English claim to Ireland as a polite suggestion rather than a law, and he spent his entire life proving that it is very difficult to govern people who own battle axes and live on top of a 100-foot cliff. For years, Sawley Boy played a game of cat and mouse with the English administration, but in 1584 the cat arrived with heavy artillery. Sir John Perrot, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, marched north with a massive army and a train of siege cannons. Perrot was a man with a lot to prove. Rumour had it he was an illegitimate son of Henry VIII, which gave him a royal ego without the royal budget. He looked at Dunluce and decided he wasn't going to starve it out, he was going to smash it down. This was the moment medieval architecture met modern ballistics. The Maquillan walls were built to stop arrows and ladders. They were not built to stop cast-iron cannonballs travelling at supersonic speeds. Perrot set up his batteries on the mainland and began to hammer the rock. The invisible black towers began to splinter. The garrison held out for as long as they could, but physics is undefeated. The walls were breached. The castle surrendered. Perrot, feeling immensely pleased with himself, installed an English garrison, patted himself on the back, and left a constable named Peter Carey in charge of the impregnable prize. But Perrot made a classic mistake. He assumed that because he held the keys he owned the house. He forgot about the cliffs. Legend tells us that Sawley Boy didn't retire to a quiet cottage to sulk. He watched, he waited, and then he sent his best men to do the impossible. One night, a small team of MacDonald commandos approached the rock. They didn't take the bridge, that was guarded. They didn't take the mermaid's cave, that was watched. Instead, they went for the sheer vertical face of the basalt stack itself. This is 100 feet of slippery, sea-sprayed volcanic rock in the dark, with the Atlantic crashing below. It is a climb that would terrify a modern alpinist with safety ropes. The Scots did it in leather boots and wool tunics. They hauled themselves up the precipice inch by silent inch. They crested the wall. They dropped into the courtyard like ghosts. The English garrison woke up to find that the impregnable fortress had a leak. The constables were dispatched. Some accounts say Peter Carey was hanged over the walls he was supposed to defend, and by sunrise the flag of the MacDonalds was flying over the rock again. Sawley Boy had reclaimed his home not with a cannon, but with fingernails and nerve. But Sawley Boy wasn't done upgrading. In 1588, the ocean delivered a gift that would turn Dunluce into a modern fortress. The Spanish Armada, the greatest fleet ever assembled to invade England, was being smashed to pieces by storms off the Irish coast. One of its greatest ships, the galleass La Girona, was driven onto the rocks at Lacarda Point, just down the coast from the castle. It was a tragedy for the 1,300 Spaniards who drowned. It was a payday for Sawley Boy. While the English government panicked about a Spanish invasion, Sawley Boy went beachcombing. He salvaged the wreck. He recovered gold, jewellery and wine. But more importantly, he recovered the hardware. He dragged the heavy brass cannons of the La Girona up the cliffs. He repaired his battered walls and mounted the Spanish guns on the ramparts. The irony was delicious. The cannons that King Philip of Spain had cast to conquer London were now sitting on an Irish cliff, pointed directly at any English soldier foolish enough to walk across the bridge. Sawley Boy had used the English Lord Deputy to test his walls and the Spanish navy to arm them. By 1590, Queen Elizabeth I, who was pragmatic if nothing else, realised that killing Sawley Boy was too expensive and arresting him was impossible. So she tried the only tactic left. She hired him. A pardon was issued. Letters patent were drawn up. The rebel was officially recognised as the Constable of Dunluce and the lord of the territory he already owned. The scene in the Great Hall must have been extraordinary. Sawley Boy, now an old man listening to the Queen's official, read the document that allowed him to live in his own house. You can imagine him sitting there surrounded by Spanish gold and Scottish soldiers, looking at the English bureaucrat with a thin smile. He had fought the clans, he had fought the crown, and he had fought gravity itself, and he had won. The golden eagle had landed and his claws were dug deep into the basalt. But while Sawley Boy had secured the rock, his descendants were about to discover that the greatest danger to Dunluce wasn't an army or a cliff. It was a dinner party. By 1600, the days of climbing cliffs with knives in your teeth were over. The MacDonalds had secured their rock, and now they wanted to enjoy it. Enter Randall MacDonald, the first Earl of Antrim. Randall was Sawley Boy's son, but he had a very different philosophy on life. Sawley Boy believed in axes, gunpowder, and sleeping with one eye open. Randall believed in investment portfolios, political manoeuvring, and central heating. He realised that while being a rebel chieftain makes for great songs, being a loyal earl makes for a much longer life expectancy. So, Randall decided to gentrify the fortress. He took the grim black basalt pile of his ancestors and attempted to turn it into a Renaissance palace. It was an architectural identity crisis of the highest order. He was trying to force a military bunker to behave like a polite English country estate. Inside the defensive walls he constructed a Jacobean manor house. He installed large limestone fireplaces to combat the eternal damp. He commissioned decorative plaster ceilings to cover the rough timber. Most audaciously, he punched large bay windows through the curtained walls. Think about the arrogance of that. For centuries, every window in Dunluce had been a narrow slit designed to let an arrow out without letting a Viking in. Randall ripped those out and installed panoramic glass. He wanted a view. He invited the Atlantic Ocean into his living room, trusting that the political storms had settled enough that he wouldn't need to board them up anytime soon. It was the 17th century equivalent of putting a conservatory on a tank. But Randall didn't just upgrade the house, he built a neighbourhood. On the mainland, just across the bridge, he established the town of Dunluce. This wasn't a collection of mud huts, it was a planned colonial settlement, a Nova Scotia on Irish soil. It had paved streets, a rarity that screamed new money, slate-roofed stone houses, merchant shops, and its own courthouse. For a brief shining moment, Dunluce was the beating heart of the North Coast economy. Merchants from Scotland docked at the Mermaid's Cave, hauling crates of French wine and fine cloth up the stairs to be sold in the town. It was a bustling cosmopolitan hub, filled with the accents of the Isles and the clinking of coin. For centuries the town was completely lost, buried under the turf like a forgotten memory. It wasn't until the 21st century that archaeologists peeled back the sod to reveal the cobblestones and hearths of the Pompeii of the north. It serves as a ghostly reminder that the MacDonalds were building a civilization here, not just a stronghold. But a palace needs a hostess, and this is where the cracks, metaphorical and physical, began to show. In 1635, Randall's son, Randall II, brought home a wife who was decidedly not from around here. Catherine Manners was the Duchess of Buckingham, the widow of the king's favourite, and a woman accustomed to the velvet-draped salons of London. She arrived at Dunluce, took one look at the crashing waves, felt the salt spray ruining her hair, and essentially asked, "Why is the house screaming at me?" Catherine hated the rock. She hated the isolation, but mostly she hated the noise. The sound of the sea at Dunluce is relentless, a low-frequency roar that vibrates through the floorboards. To the early chieftains who dug the suit around, this white noise was likely a tactical comfort. It masked their movements. To Catherine Manners, it was torture. Catherine's intuition was better than Randall's engineering. The castle was heavy, the basalt was fractured, and the kitchen, bustling with servants preparing for the nightly feast, was sitting on the most unstable corner of the stack. The Renaissance dream was about to have a very rude awakening. The cliff had been patient for 60 million years, but its patience had just run out. In 1639, the inevitable finally happened. You can bribe a king, you can marry a duchess, and you can fight off the English army, but you cannot negotiate with erosion. For centuries the Atlantic had been gnawing at the base of the basalt stack. It was a slow, invisible siege. Every wave that crashed into the cave below acted like a microscopic hammer, vibrating through the rock. The salt spray was dissolving the lime mortar that held the stones together, and the freezing winter winds were widening the hairline cracks in the cliff face. The castle was tired. It was holding up thousands of tons of masonry, a new manor house, and the ego of the MacDonald clan, all while balancing on a foundation that was slowly turning into gravel. The kitchen specifically was living on borrowed time. It was perched on the northeast corner of the stack, cantilevered over the abyss. It was the busiest room in the castle, filled with the heat of the ovens, the weight of the staff, and the frantic energy of a noble household at dinner time. On a stormy night in December 1639, the bill came due. The scene inside was one of warmth and excess. The second Earl and Duchess Catherine were hosting a grand dinner in the Great Hall. The wine was flowing, the fire was roaring, and the conversation was likely drifting toward the terrible weather outside. In the kitchen, the staff were preparing the next course. Cooks were shouting, pots were banging, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. And then physics stepped in. There was a sound that wasn't thunder. It was a grinding, tearing screech of stone separating from stone. In a split second, the structural integrity of the northeast corner failed. The cliff face sheared away. The floor of the kitchen didn't just collapse, it vanished. The ovens, the preparation tables, the simmering pots, the dinner, and tragically the staff, dropped 100 feet into the churning black water below. The silence that followed must have been deafening. One moment, there was the noise of a busy kitchen. The next, there was only the howling of the wind and the roar of the sea. The Atlantic Ocean had just claimed the soup course, and the people who made it. In the great hall, the dinner party came to a sudden, confused halt. The service stopped. The door to the kitchen opened onto nothing. Just a jagged, gaping hole where the castle used to be, and the terrifying sight of white foam crashing on the rocks far below. But the ocean, in a moment of strange mercy, spared one man. The legend of the Tinker is one of the most enduring stories of the North Coast. A young kitchen boy, or perhaps a travelling tinker fixing pots, was sitting in the window nook of the kitchen, likely taking a break or staying out of the way of the head cook. When the floor gave way, the main section of the room fell, but the corner where the window nook stood remained attached to the main wall. The boy was left clinging to the stonework, staring down into the void where his co-workers had been standing 3 seconds earlier. He was the sole survivor of the collapse, a terrified witness to the moment the castle decided it had had enough. For Catherine Manners, this wasn't a tragedy. It was an I told you so of epic proportions. She had hated the rock, she had feared the cliff, and now the house had literally tried to kill her servants. The romance of living on the edge was gone, replaced by the very real possibility that the bedroom might be next. She refused to spend another night under that roof. The MacDonalds packed their bags. They abandoned the dramatic wind-battered basalt stack and moved inland to Glenarm Castle, a sensible, sturdy house built on solid ground, far away from the hungry Atlantic. Dunluce was no longer a home. The fires in the great hall were extinguished. The bay windows that Randall had so proudly installed were left to stare blindly out at the sea. The roof began to leak, the furniture was moved out, and the Renaissance palace began its slow, inevitable slide into ruin. The kitchen fell in 1639, but in reality it took the heart of the castle with it. The rock had won. The MacDonalds kept the title, but the sea kept the house. The kitchen had fallen, the Duchess had fled, and the MacDonalds had retreated to the safety of Glenarm. But Dunluce wasn't dead yet. It was just vulnerable, and in the 17th century, vulnerability was an invitation for the worst kind of houseguest. Enter General Robert Monroe. Monroe was a Scottish Covenanter, a man who treated war with the humorless efficiency of an auditor. In 1642, during the chaos of the Irish Confederate Wars, he arrived at Dunluce. He didn't come with siege engines, he came with a smile. He was ostensibly an ally of the Earl of Antrim, there to discuss the mutual defence of the realm. The Earl, Randall MacDonald, the second Earl who was having a terrible decade, did what any gentleman would do. He prepared a feast. Despite the missing kitchen, the staff managed to pull together a dinner. The wine was poured, toasts were likely made to friendship and shared Scottish heritage. Then, at the signal, Monroe stopped eating and started arresting. It was a betrayal that violated every ancient law of hospitality. In the Highlands, you don't harm a man once you've broken his bread. Monroe didn't care about Highland codes. He cared about strategic assets. He arrested the Earl at his own table, seized his castle, and looted his goods. It was a hostile takeover performed with a fork in one hand and a warrant in the other. Monroe garrisoned his men in the castle, but they were soldiers, not custodians. They didn't care about the plasterwork ceilings or the bay windows. To them, Dunluce was just a cold, damp barracks on a rock. When they finally left, they didn't hand the keys back, they left the door open. And then the scavengers arrived. A castle is a very expensive thing to maintain, but it is a very profitable thing to dismantle. Once the garrison was gone, Dunluce became the largest hardware store in County Antrim. The first thing to go was the roof. The roofs of the Renaissance manor were lined with tons of lead. In the 17th century, lead was liquid money. It could be melted down into musket balls or sold for cash. The looters climbed up, stripped the sheets, and rolled them off like carpets. Without the lead roof, the great oak beams were left naked against the Irish sky. Then came the rain. If you know anything about the North Antrim coast, you know that the rain there is not a weather event. It is an aggressive force of nature. It soaked into the timbers. It rotted the floors. It dissolved the plasterwork that Randall had paid a fortune for. The Renaissance palace began to melt. The nearby town of Dunluce suffered an even quicker fate. It became the ultimate recycling project. Why quarry new stone to build a farmhouse when there is a perfectly good town sitting empty down the road? The cobblestones were pulled up. The slate roofs were dismantled. The walls were knocked down and carted off to build barns and fences. The thriving merchant port was cannibalized until nothing remained but the grass growing over the foundations. By the 18th century, Dunluce had ceased to be a building and had become a feature. It entered its goth phase. The Romantics, that generation of poets and painters who loved nothing more than a good tragedy, fell in love with the place. They didn't see a military failure. They saw the sublime. They saw the skeletal remains of ambition silhouetted against the grey sky. They wrote bad poetry about the awful silence and the melancholy roar of the waves. The castle had transitioned from a place of power to a memento mori, a giant stone reminder that no matter how high you build your walls, or how much gold you pull from a Spanish shipwreck, eventually the roof will rot and the rain will get in. The MacDonalds were still the Earls of Antrim, but they were landlords of a ghost. The rock belonged to the Gulls again. The 19th century brought a new kind of invader to Dunluce. They didn't carry pikes or muskets. They carried sketchbooks and adjectives. The Romantic movement had convinced Europe that ruins weren't just piles of garbage, they were atmospheric. Dunluce became a celebrity in the world of crumbling stone. William Makepeace Thackeray visited and described it as wild and savage, a place where the melancholy roar of the ocean set the mood. It was the architectural equivalent of a brooding teenager. But the most famous literary connection is one of pure fantasy. A Belfast-born writer named C.S. Lewis grew up exploring the north coast. He saw the ruins of Dunluce perched on the cliff, the waves crashing below, and the feeling of a once great royal seat. When he sat down to write the Chronicles of Narnia, the image of Cair Paravel, the castle of the Four Thrones, sitting on a peninsula by the eastern sea, was etched into his memory. Dunluce isn't just an Irish ruin. For millions of children it is the capital of Narnia, stripped of its magic but keeping its majesty. Then came the cameras. In the 21st century, Dunluce got a job in Hollywood. When the location scouts for Game of Thrones needed a home for the House Greyjoy, a family of pirate raiders who worship a drowned god and live on bleak, storm-lashed islands, they didn't have to look far. Dunluce became Pike. They used CGI to add a few more rope bridges and impossible towers, but the soul of the place, the black rock, the grey sea, the hostility of the landscape, was all real. Sorely Boy MacDonald would have recognised the Ironborn immediately. They were just Vikings with better agents. Today, the battle for Dunluce has shifted. We aren't fighting the English anymore, we are fighting entropy. The drawbridge that once dropped to admit friendly horses has been replaced by a sturdy, stationary modern bridge. It doesn't trap you, which is a nice safety feature. The walls are no longer defended by gallows glass with axes, but by structural engineers with concrete injection guns. They're fighting a slow, desperate war to stitch the basalt together, to keep the stone giant from sliding into the sea like the kitchen did. It is preservation replacing conquest. We prop up the skeleton so we can remember the body. But if you want to understand the real Dunluce, you don't look at the walls. You go down, take the stairs to the Mermaid's Cave, walk down the steep, rock-cut steps that the MacDonalds used to haul their supplies, step into the darkness of the cavern, listen. The sound is deafening. The Atlantic swells roll in, smash against the basalt, and retreat in a hiss of white foam. It is a violent, rhythmic heartbeat that shakes the ground beneath your feet. This is the sound the ancients heard when they dug their souterrain. This is the sound the Vikings heard as they sailed past. This is the sound Catherine Manners heard before she packed her bags. This is the sound Sorely Boy heard as he plotted his return. The roofs have been stripped. The kitchen is gone, the MacDonalds are ghosts, but the sea is still there, still eating the rock, still watching the horizon, still waiting for the next tide. In 1172, the River Boyne was not a peaceful place. It was a border, a moving line between worlds. On one bank stood Gaelic Ireland, a land of kings, clans, cattle roads and hill forts. On the other stood a new force that had arrived with chainmail, siege engines, and a very confident understanding of paperwork. The Anglo-Normans had come. King Henry II of England crossed into Ireland to bring his restless Norman lords under control and extend his authority westward. Among them was a man with an appetite for land and a talent for building. His name was Hugh de Lacy. Henry rewarded de Lacy with something called the Liberty of Meath, a vast stretch of central Ireland reaching from the Boyne almost to the Shannon. It was not just an estate, it was a private kingdom, and Hugh de Lacy intended to rule it properly. He chose his capital carefully. At Trim, the River Boyne narrows into a natural crossing point. Roads converge, trade flows, armies pass. Whoever controls the bridge controls the movement of the entire region. It was the kind of place that attracts attention. which is exactly why de Lacy built there. The first Trim castle was not the giant of limestone we see today. It was a ringwork, an earthen mound surrounded by a timber palisade, crowned with a wooden tower. Fast to build, easy to repair, terrifying to the unarmoured. It rose above the Boyne like a warning, spiked walls, watch platforms, a forest of sharpened timber. To the Normans it was progress. To the Irish kings it was an invasion. The High King of Ireland watched the construction with growing anger. This was not just a fort, it was a statement. In 1174, while Hugh de Lacy was away in England attending the king, the High King gathered an army and marched on Trim. It was enormous. Chroniclers describe thousands of warriors moving across the plains, banners snapping in the wind, cattle driven before them, war horns echoing across the valley. The wooden fort stood alone on its mound. Inside, the Norman garrison watched the horizon darken with movement. They knew they could not hold it. Wood burns, earth collapses, and help was days away. So they made a decision. They set fire to their own fortress. The palisade went up first, flames racing along the timber walls. The tower followed, its dry beams cracking and roaring as smoke rolled across the Boyne. Then they fled. By the time the Irish army arrived, they found only ashes and embers where the Norman stronghold had stood. The hill still smoked. The message was clear. Trim was contested ground. The river crossing was worth fighting for, and Hugh de Lacy would not be discouraged. He returned 2 years later, and this time he would build in stone. When Hugh de Lacy returned to Trim in 1176, he returned with a lesson learned. Wood had failed, earth had burned. If Meath was going to be held, it would be held with stone. The river still curved gently past the crossing. The old ringwork mound still marked the place where the wooden fort had stood and fallen. The geography had not changed. Only the scale of ambition. De Lacy did not rebuild the timber fort. He replaced it. What rose on the banks of the Boyne was not a tower, not a hall, not a simple stronghold. It was a fortress designed to dominate an entire region. At its heart stood a keep unlike anything Ireland had ever seen. Trim Castle's great tower was built on a cruciform plan, a massive central block with 4 rectangular towers projecting outward like the arms of a cross. From above, the structure resembles a stone compass, planted firmly in the landscape and pointing in every direction at once. It is sometimes described as a 20-sided keep. More accurately, it is a geometric statement. Each face catches the light differently. Each tower commands a different approach. Every angle exists for a reason. The walls were built nearly 3 meters thick. Local limestone was quarried and hauled to the site in enormous blocks. Mortar was mixed slowly, carefully, designed to cure into something that would last for centuries. This was not fast construction. It was permanent construction. The keep rose level by level. Storage chambers and guard rooms formed the base. Great halls filled the middle floors. Private chambers occupied the heights. Staircases were threaded through the walls like veins through stone. Fireplaces were carved directly into the masonry. Windows were cut deep into the towers, forming long tunnels of light. Around the base of the keep ran a chemise wall, a close-fitting outer ring of stone that wrapped the tower in a second layer of protection. Beyond that lay a water-filled moat, fed directly from the River Boyne. Anyone approaching the keep would have to cross water, then stone, then open ground, and only then reach the walls themselves. It was not designed to be polite. It was designed to be discouraging. From the valley the keep rose like a pale cliff. Its limestone walls reflected the sun, making the fortress visible for miles. Travellers approaching Trim did not need directions. They followed the castle. The scale of the building changed the town around it. Workshops appeared to supply the construction. Quarries expanded. Roads were improved to carry stone. Trim became a building site that lasted for decades. This was not a project for one lifetime, and Hugh de Lacy would not see it finished. In 1186, while supervising construction at another fortress, de Lacy was assassinated, struck down by an Irish noble while standing on scaffolding according to later accounts. The man who conceived Trim's transformation never walked its completed halls. The castle passed to his son, Walter de Lacy. Walter inherited not just a fortress, but an ongoing architectural campaign. He continued the work. The keep rose higher, battlements were added, the upper floors were refined. The fortress began to take on a more ceremonial character. It was no longer just a defensive machine. It was becoming a palace. Decorative crenellations crowned the towers. Stone carving softened the edges. Staterooms replaced storage chambers. Trim was becoming a residence fit for a ruler. By the early 13th century, the keep stood complete. The chemise walls circled its base. The moat shimmered beneath its walls. The river flowed past like a silver ribbon. Around it, curtain walls enclosed a growing inner ward. Gatehouses controlled access. Towers watched the bridge. The fortress expanded outward from its stone heart. By 1224, Trim Castle had become the largest Anglo-Norman fortress in Ireland, not just in height, not just in footprint, but in authority. The burned wooden fort of 1174 had been replaced by a limestone giant, a structure meant not merely to resist attack, but to define a territory. The river crossing was no longer just a crossing, it was a gateway. And beyond those gates lay a lordship that would soon become one of the most powerful states in medieval Ireland. By the early 13th century, Trim Castle was no longer simply a fortress. It was a capital. The great limestone keep stood at the centre of a fortified town, its towers rising above the Boyne Valley like a permanent declaration of authority. Roads converged at its gates, markets clustered beneath its walls, bridges funneled traffic through its shadow. Trim was the heart of the liberty of Meath. This was not a county, it was not a province, it was a private state. The lords of Meath ruled their territory with remarkable independence. They held courts, collected taxes, issued charters, enforced their own laws. For generations they governed a lordship that stretched across much of central Ireland. From the ramparts the view reached across some of the richest farmland on the island. The plains rolled outward in long green waves, cut by rivers and roads that all led, eventually, back to the castle. The river carried trade, the roads carried power, the keep watched everything. Inside the walls life followed the rhythm of administration. Messengers arrived daily. Petitioners waited in the outer ward. Merchants crossed the bridge with carts of grain and wool. The great hall rang with voices. The Lord of Meath presided over disputes and land grants. Here, rents were paid, treaties signed, laws debated. At times, even the Parliament of Ireland met beneath the castle's beams. It was a government wrapped in battlements. The liberty of Meath had its own identity. It minted its own coins. It enforced its own courts. It guarded its own borders. In practice, it functioned as a kingdom in miniature. But the English crown never fully trusted its Irish lords. They were too powerful, too wealthy, too independent. And so, in 1210, King John crossed the Irish Sea with a fleet and an army, determined to remind the Anglo-Norman lords who ultimately ruled. His campaign swept across the island. Castles were inspected, lords were summoned, allegiances were tested. Trim prepared itself. The gates were secured, the garrison reinforced, the bridge guarded. The king camped outside the walls. He walked the perimeter. He studied the towers. He counted the battlements. Later tradition claims that John was so impressed by the scale and strength of the keep that he chose not to sleep inside it, preferring a tent beyond the walls to a fortress that did not yet fully belong to him. Whether true or not, the story survived because it captures something real. Trim was powerful enough to make kings cautious. The campaign ended with Walter de Lacy stripped of much of his independence. His lands were seized and redistributed. The liberty of Meath was drawn more tightly into royal control, but the castle remained. Trim continued to dominate the Boyne Valley. Over the next 2 centuries it hosted judges, bishops, nobles and administrators. It served as the administrative heart of English Ireland. Its great hall saw feasts, councils and ceremonies. The fortress had become a court. Then, in 1399, Trim received another royal guest. King Richard II arrived in Ireland with his household and retinue. Banners flew from the towers. Trumpets echoed through the town. The castle once again became a royal residence. With him came a boy, Prince Hal, the future Henry V. The king who would one day stand at Agincourt was left at Trim as a royal hostage, a guarantee of loyalty, a reminder of power. The boy prince spent his days beneath the shadow of the great keep. The towers watched his archery practice. The walls heard his tutor's lectures. The river carried his reflection past the gates. It is said he trained in the outer ward, firing arrows toward targets set against the curtain wall, learning the patience of a bow and the discipline of a soldier. If so, Trim provided a fitting classroom. It was a place that taught authority. For nearly 2 centuries the castle had ruled the plains of Meath, a capital carved from limestone, a court with a moat, a parliament with arrow slits. But beyond the walls the world was changing. Gaelic power was rising again, the Pale was shrinking, and gunpowder was beginning to rewrite the rules of war. The age of feudal lordship was drawing to a close, and Trim, once the unquestioned ruler of the Boyne, was about to find itself once more on the edge of a dangerous frontier. By the beginning of the 15th century, the world around Trim Castle had changed. The great Norman lordships of Ireland were no longer expanding, they were contracting. Beyond the walls of Trim, Gaelic power was rising again. Irish kings reclaimed territory that had once belonged to the Anglo-Norman lords. Old alliances collapsed. Borderlands hardened. Roads became dangerous. The wide plains of Meath, once the calm heart of Norman Ireland, became the edge of a shrinking frontier. This frontier was known as the Pale. It was the area of land still firmly under English control, a rough circle of fortresses, towns and estates centred on Dublin. Everything beyond it was considered hostile territory. Trim now stood on that edge. Once a capital, it became a border post again. Its great keep still dominated the Boyne Valley, but now it watched not trade caravans and royal processions, but war bands and shifting loyalties. The river crossing returned to its older role, a choke point, a gateway, a place where roads were measured in risk. The castle adapted. The curtain walls were strengthened. The gates were reinforced. The garrison grew. Trim was no longer hosting parliaments. It was guarding borders. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the region lived under constant pressure. Raids swept in from the west. Retaliations followed. Fields were burned, livestock driven off. Villages fortified themselves behind ditches and stone. The castle stood at the centre of it all, but a new enemy had arrived. Gunpowder. The high stone walls that had once been the ultimate defence were now large, immobile targets. Cannon did not care about battlements. They respected only distance and thickness. Trim's towers, once symbols of strength, became aiming points. The medieval age of castle warfare was ending, and then came 1649. Oliver Cromwell landed in Ireland with an army trained in the brutal efficiency of modern war. His campaign was swift, relentless, and merciless. Town after town fell. Castle after castle surrendered or was battered into submission. Trim prepared for siege. Its gates were closed, its garrison braced. Its great keep loomed over the river as it always had, but stone alone could not stop cannon. Cromwell's artillery breached the curtain walls. Shot tore through battlements that had stood for centuries. The great outer defences were smashed open. Trim fell. The fortress that had ruled Meath for 400 years was broken. The keep survived, too massive to be demolished easily, but the castle's role as a military stronghold was over. The walls were deliberately damaged to prevent reuse. Roofs were removed. Interior floors collapsed. The great stone giant was left hollow. The river still flowed past its base. The tower still rose over the town. But the age of castles had ended. Trim was no longer a capital, no longer a frontier post, no longer a seat of power. It had become a ruin, and for the next 2 centuries it would stand in silence, watching the Boyne pass beneath its broken walls. After the cannons fell silent and the armies moved on, Trim Castle entered a new phase of its life. It did not collapse, it did not disappear, it simply stopped being necessary. The great keep still stood on the banks of the Boyne, its towers rising above the town as they always had. But its roofs were gone, its floors had fallen inward, rain pooled where feasts had once been held, grass took root in the mortar joints, the stone giant had been hollowed out. For the people of Trim, the castle was no longer a seat of power, it was a resource. Throughout the 18th century the ruins became a convenient quarry. Blocks of limestone were taken from fallen walls and broken towers and carried into the town. They became houses, boundary walls, barns and bridges. Trim was, quite literally, built from trim. The fortress that once guarded the river crossing slowly dissolved into the streets below it. A doorway might be framed with stones that had once been part of the great keep. A garden wall might be built from the same limestone that once faced an army. The castle was still there, but it was also everywhere. Despite the scavenging, the great keep refused to vanish. Its core was too massive, its foundations too deep, its walls too thick. It endured as a stone skeleton. By the early 19th century, attitudes began to change. The age of industry was rising. Cities expanded. Railways cut through fields. Factories reshaped skylines. And suddenly, the old ruins that had once been seen as inconvenient relics became something else. They became romantic. Artists arrived with sketchbooks. Poets arrived with notebooks. Travellers arrived on horseback and later by train, climbing the hill above the Boyne to wander through the empty shell of the keep. They stood beneath the towers and imagined banners. They walked the curtain walls and imagined guards. They traced their hands across the limestone and imagined kings. Trim Castle was no longer a fortress. It was a story. In the later 1800s, the castle was formally recognised as a national monument. The quarrying slowed. The walls were stabilised. The ruin was protected from further dismantling. The stone skeleton was preserved. And then, centuries after its last siege, Trim Castle found a new career. In the 1990s, film crews arrived. Scaffolding went up. Timber walkways were built. Temporary battlements were raised. The castle's rugged profile was transformed into medieval London and York for the filming of Braveheart. For a brief moment, banners flew again. The keep filled with extras. The courtyards rang with shouting. The river carried reflections of camera rigs and cranes. It is said that some locals believed the castle was being fully restored to its medieval glory. It was not. But for a short while, Trim returned to the role it had played for centuries. A fortress, a symbol, a stage for history. When filming ended, the sets were dismantled. The scaffolding came down, the crowds left. The castle returned to silence. The Boyne flowed past its walls. The towers watched the town. The ruin remained, no longer a capital, no longer a border post, no longer a military stronghold, just a monument of stone standing patiently on the riverbank, waiting. When the last soldiers had gone and the last scaffolding was taken down, Trim Castle settled into a different kind of life. Not as a fortress, not as a capital, not even as a ruin, but as a place of memory. The stone giant still rises from the bank of the River Boyne, its pale limestone walls catching the light as they have for more than 8 centuries. The towers no longer carry banners. The gates no longer close at dusk. The moat no longer fills with water. And yet the castle remains exactly where Hugh de Lacy first stood and looked across the river. The crossing still matters. The river still moves. The walls still watch. With age comes stories. Trim has gathered more than its share. One of the most persistent is the tale of a secret tunnel. It is said that a hidden passage runs from the lowest chambers of the Great Keep, beneath the River Boyne itself, and emerges on the far bank at the ruins of St Mary's Abbey and its tall tower known as the Yellow Steeple. The idea is irresistible. A stone artery beneath the water, a silent escape route for besieged lords, a hidden road for monks and messengers. No tunnel has ever been found, but the story refuses to leave. The Yellow Steeple still stands across the river, its tall, narrow form rising above the trees like a watchtower that forgot its original purpose. Once part of a great Augustinian abbey, it later served as an extra set of eyes for the castle, watching the approaches to the bridge and the river road. From the keep, the tower is clearly visible, close enough to invite imagination, far enough to protect its secrets. Inside the castle, preservation has taken a modern form. The Office of Public Works now cares for the fortress. Its task is not to rebuild the past, but to protect what remains. The walls are stabilised, the towers are reinforced, the stone is watched carefully, and within the keep a new structure has been added. Steel and glass walkways now thread through the hollow shell of the great tower, allowing visitors to climb through the heart of the building without touching its fragile edges. Standing on these platforms, you can look up through the empty floors and see sky framed by battlements. The keep has become a vertical cathedral of stone and light. You walk where lords once stood. You climb where soldiers once waited. You pause where banners once hung. The castle does not speak. It simply holds. Outside, the river keeps moving. The Boyne flows past the walls as it always has, carrying rain from the hills and reflections of clouds. Swans drift along its surface. Reeds bend at its edge. In the evening, the water darkens and turns the limestone towers into long shadows. The river does not remember battles. It remembers only motion. Trim Castle stands beside it like a stone book left open on the same page for centuries. A fortress that became a capital that became a ruin that became a monument, and through it all the Boyne has kept its course. If you stand on the bridge at dusk and look up at the keep, the walls glow softly in the last light of day. The town settles behind you. The water slips past beneath your feet. The castle does not demand attention. It waits. And the river continues to carry its reflection downstream, past fields and hedges and quiet bends, just as it did when the first wooden fort burned on the hill in 1174.